I'm deeply honored to have worn the cloth of this nation for 43 and a half years, and I'm humbled to have served as the 20th Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But today is not about anyone up here on this stage. It's not about the President, the Secretary of Defense, me, CQ. It's not about us. It's about something much larger than all of us. It's about our democracy. It's about our republic. We are unique among the world's armies. We are unique among the world's militaries. We don't take an oath to a country. We don't take an oath to a tribe. We don't take an oath to a religion. We don't take an oath to a king or a queen or to a tyrant or a dictator. And we don't take an oath to a wannabe dictator. We don't take an oath to an individual. We take an oath to the Constitution, and we take an oath to the idea that is America, and we're willing to die to protect it. Those values and ideas are contained within the Constitution of the United States of America, which is the moral North Star for all of us who have the privilege of wearing the cloth of our nation. It is that document that all of us in uniform swear to protect and defend against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Those who sacrificed themselves on the altar of freedom in the last 2.5 centuries of this country must not have done so in vain. The millions wounded in our nation's wars did not sacrifice their limbs and shed their blood to see this great experiment in democracy perish from this earth. No, we the American people, we the American military, must never turn our back on those that came before us. And we will never turn our back on the Constitution. That is our North Star, that is who we are, and that is why we fight. Thank you, and may God bless our military, and may God bless the United States of America.
Welcome to my channel. This is an independent journalism channel, since we know we can no longer trust traditional media, which are easily corrupted. Your subscription would help a lot as we start this big project. Here, you'll stay informed about the news that mainstream media isn't willing to cover. Okay, so something absolutely unprecedented just happened in American civil-military relations, and the implications are staggering. We're talking about retired 4-star generals, people who commanded hundreds of thousands of troops, people who spent their entire adult lives in uniform defending this country. And they're now publicly warning that a former president poses a direct threat to the Constitution they swore to protect. This isn't political theater. This isn't partisan noise. This is the military establishment, the most traditionally nonpartisan institution in American life, breaking decades of silence to sound an alarm. And what they're saying should terrify every single person who cares about how this republic actually functions. Here's what happened. In a farewell address that's already being called historic, the outgoing chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff delivered what can only be described as a constitutional warning shot. Standing before thousands, this general, who wore the uniform for over 43 years, who reached the absolute pinnacle of military leadership, made something crystal clear. The oath that every service member takes isn't to a person. It's not to a political party. It's not to a president, no matter who that president is. The oath is to the Constitution, and only the Constitution. And then he said something that made everyone in that room sit up straight. He said, "We don't take an oath to a wannabe dictator." Let that sink in for a second. The top military officer in the United States, in his final official remarks, felt compelled to remind everyone that the American military does not serve dictators or aspiring dictators. He didn't name names. He didn't have to. Everyone knew exactly who he was talking about. And this wasn't just one retiring general having a moment. This came alongside warnings from multiple retired 4-star admirals and generals, all of them saying essentially the same thing. What's happening right now with the military, with how certain political leaders are trying to use military power, is dangerous. It's unconstitutional. And it's exactly the kind of thing that destroys democracies. Now, here's where this gets even more serious. These aren't political appointees. These aren't activists. These are people who dedicated their entire lives to staying out of politics, to serving whoever the American people elected, regardless of party. Many of them served under both Republican and Democratic presidents. They commanded troops in combat. They managed nuclear arsenals. They sat in the Situation Room during national security crises. When people like this start speaking out publicly, when they break the traditional code of silence that retired military officers maintain, it means something has gone profoundly wrong. It means the threat they're seeing is so serious that their obligation to warn the public outweighs their preference to stay quiet. So what exactly are they warning about? Let's break this down, because the pattern they're describing is chilling, and it's not hypothetical. It's based on specific incidents, specific statements, specific actions that have already happened. First, there's the issue of politicizing the military. Now, presidential visits to troops are normal. Every commander-in-chief does them. But there are rules, unwritten but sacred, about how those visits work. You thank the troops. You talk about their mission. You express gratitude for their service. You do not, under any circumstances, turn it into a partisan political rally. You don't attack your domestic political opponents. You don't campaign. You don't use soldiers as props for your political agenda. Why? Because those troops are a captive audience. They're required to be there. They can't leave. They can't respond. They can't publicly disagree. Using them as a backdrop for partisan politics puts them in an impossible position and violates fundamental norms about keeping the military out of political fights. According to the retired generals who are speaking out, Trump did exactly that during a speech to over 6,000 U.S. troops stationed in Japan. He turned what should have been a morale visit into a political event, attacking opponents, promoting his agenda, treating uniformed service members like they were attendees at a campaign rally. Here's the problem, and this is what the generals are furious about. If a uniformed officer did that, if a colonel or a general used their position to deliver partisan political messages to troops under their command, they would face immediate consequences. We're talking removal from command, possible court-martial, end of career. The Uniform Code of Military Justice is extremely strict about this. Military officers are forbidden from using their authority for partisan political purposes. It's one of the most serious violations you can commit. But the president, as commander-in-chief, faces no such institutional check. There's no military tribunal for the president. There's no mechanism to hold them accountable for politicizing the force in the same way a uniformed officer would be held accountable. And that's exactly what makes this so dangerous. The person with the most power over the military, the one who can order deployments, who controls nuclear weapons, who has the authority to federalize the National Guard, that person can violate norms that would destroy anyone else's career. And there's no immediate institutional consequence. The only check is political, through elections or impeachment, and those are slow, uncertain, and deeply partisan. In the meantime, the damage to military professionalism, to the nonpartisan culture that keeps the armed forces loyal to the Constitution rather than to individuals, that damage happens in real time. But it gets worse, because politicizing troop visits is just one piece of a much larger pattern. Multiple retired generals have warned about proposals to use the military domestically in ways that violate both law and fundamental democratic principles. One of the most alarming examples involves comments about using American cities as military training grounds. Think about what that means. Military training is designed for warfare. It involves combat tactics, weapon systems, rules of engagement meant for defeating foreign enemies on battlefields. The suggestion that cities with high crime rates could serve as training environments fundamentally reframes American citizens as potential adversaries and normalizes the presence of combat troops in domestic settings. This directly conflicts with the Posse Comitatus Act, a law that's been on the books since 1878, which restricts the use of federal military forces for domestic law enforcement. That law exists for a reason. It exists because military forces are trained to destroy enemies, not to police civilian populations. They're trained to win battles, not to protect civil liberties. When you deploy soldiers trained for combat into civilian law enforcement situations, bad things happen. People get hurt. Rights get violated. The line between citizen and enemy starts to blur. And once you normalize that, once you start thinking of American cities as battlefields and American citizens as training targets, you've crossed a line that democracies don't come back from easily. Even if such proposals never get fully implemented, even if they remain mostly rhetorical, the retired generals warn that just normalizing this language, just making it seem acceptable to talk about deploying military force against American cities, that alone erodes public resistance. It weakens the psychological and cultural barriers that protect democratic society from authoritarian practices. It makes the unthinkable thinkable. And that's how democracies die. not usually in dramatic coups, but in gradual erosion of norms, in the slow acceptance of things that previous generations would have rejected immediately as obviously tyrannical. Then there's the National Guard issue, and this is where the constitutional concerns become even more acute. The National Guard occupies a unique position in American federalism. Guard units are state militias under the authority of governors, unless and until the president federalizes them for national emergencies or wartime deployment. This dual structure exists as a check on federal power. It means that if a president wants to use military force domestically, they can't just unilaterally deploy federal troops. They need cooperation from governors, or they need to invoke specific federal authorities that come with legal constraints and political costs. According to the warnings from retired flag officers, there have been efforts to federalize National Guard units from states whose governors resist certain policies, essentially stripping state authority and centralizing military control in the executive branch for partisan political purposes. This is extraordinarily dangerous. It means taking military forces away from elected governors and putting them under the direct control of the president, potentially to enforce policies that state governments oppose, potentially to act against civilian populations in those states. Think about what that means for service members. They sign up to defend the country. They might find themselves in situations where they're being ordered to enforce politically controversial policies against civilians in their home states, maybe even against their own communities. They're trained to follow orders, but they're also bound by law to refuse illegal orders. If those orders come from the president, if they're wrapped in claims of emergency authority or national security, how do individual soldiers and officers navigate that? The legal ambiguity, the political pressure, the personal moral weight, it's an impossible position. And think about what it means for civilians. If you're a citizen in a state where your governor is resisting federal policy, and suddenly federal troops, including Guard members from your own state but now under federal control, are deployed to enforce that policy, what recourse do you have? Your state government, your elected representatives, they've been overruled. The military force that's supposed to answer to them has been taken away. You're facing the direct power of the federal executive, with very few institutional checks remaining. That's not how the American system is supposed to work. The framers deliberately divided military authority precisely to prevent this kind of concentrated power.
Now, let's talk about one of the most revealing incidents in this whole saga, because it shows exactly how dangerous the dynamic has become. Democratic lawmakers, some of them military veterans themselves, sent a message to service members reminding them of a basic principle of military law. They reminded troops that they have not just a right, but a legal obligation to refuse unlawful orders. This isn't controversial. This is established doctrine. It's been recognized since the Nuremberg trials. Following illegal orders is not a defense against war crimes. If you're ordered to commit an atrocity, if you're ordered to violate the Constitution, if you're ordered to do something that clearly breaks the law, you must refuse. That's not insubordination. That's adherence to a higher law. The lawmakers' message was educational. It was factual. It was reminding service members of something they should already know from their training. There was nothing seditious about it. There was no call for mutiny. It was simply a reminder. Your oath is to the Constitution, and that oath sometimes requires saying no to illegal orders, even if those orders come from the very top. How did Trump respond? He called these lawmakers traitors. He accused them of sedition. He amplified rhetoric suggesting they deserved execution. Read that again. Lawmakers, including veterans, reminded troops of their legal obligation to refuse unlawful orders, and the response was to label them traitors deserving of death. What does that tell you? It tells you that the expectation is absolute obedience, regardless of legality. It tells you that reminding service members of their legal and moral obligations is seen as an act of betrayal. It tells you that the line between lawful military command and demands for personal loyalty has been obliterated. And here's what terrifies the retired generals who are speaking out. This puts troops in an impossible bind. If they obey an unlawful order, they face potential criminal liability, potential war crimes charges, potential moral destruction. If they refuse, they face retaliation from political leadership that has publicly labeled refusal as treason.
This is not a theoretical problem. This is not some abstract constitutional debate. This affects real people, young men and women in uniform who signed up to serve their country and now find themselves navigating a minefield where doing the right thing legally might destroy their careers, or worse, and doing the wrong thing might destroy their souls and land them in prison. The retired 4-star officers warning about this have seen what happens when militaries become politicized, when the line between lawful orders and personal loyalty blurs. They've studied history. They know how democracies fail. And they're telling us, in the clearest possible terms, that what's happening now fits the pattern. Authoritarian leaders always follow similar playbooks. They demand personal loyalty from the military. They attack professional officers who maintain independence. They politicize the armed forces. They treat dissent as treason. They blur the lines between legitimate security concerns and political oppression. They centralize military power in the executive. They erode checks and balances. Every single one of these things has either happened already or been attempted. These aren't hypotheticals. These aren't predictions. These are descriptions of what's already on the record. And here's why the military establishment is so alarmed. Civil military norms aren't just nice traditions. They're not just customs that make things run smoothly. They are essential safeguards that prevent the armed forces from becoming tools of authoritarian control. Those norms ensure that the military serves the Constitution and the country, not an individual leader. Those norms create space for professional military advice that might contradict political preferences. Those norms protect service members from being used as political pawns. Those norms maintain the boundary between military force, which is designed to defeat enemies, and civilian governance, which is designed to protect rights and maintain democratic legitimacy.
When those norms erode, when they're violated repeatedly, when violations are normalized and defended, the danger isn't just immediate misuse of military power, though that's bad enough. The danger is long-term, systemic damage to the relationship between the armed forces and democratic institutions. A politicized military might, in the future, refuse lawful orders from leaders it doesn't like politically, or it might comply with unlawful orders from leaders it does like. Either scenario destroys civilian control of the military, which is absolutely fundamental to constitutional government. Without civilian control, without a military that serves the Constitution rather than personalities, you don't have a democracy. You have something else entirely. The retired generals speaking out understand this in their bones. They've commanded troops in war. They've managed crises. They've studied military history and the history of republics that failed. Their warnings reflect institutional memory, professional judgment, and genuine fear that the safeguards Americans take for granted are being dismantled in real time. These aren't partisan hacks. These aren't people trying to score political points. These are professionals who would vastly prefer to remain silent, to maintain the traditional distance between retired military leaders and political controversy. The fact that they're speaking out anyway tells you everything you need to know about how serious they believe the threat is. Now, let's talk about the political implications, because this matters electorally in ways that might not be obvious. Trump has built a significant part of his brand on being pro-military, on being the candidate of strength, on being the person who supports the troops and respects military power. That message resonates with a lot of voters, including many veterans and military families. But when respected four-star generals, people who commanded in combat, people who reached the absolute pinnacle of military leadership, when they start publicly saying that Trump's conduct endangers the Constitution and threatens service members, that creates a crack in the narrative.
The military community isn't politically monolithic, but it does value certain things almost universally: professionalism, legality, honor, the chain of command, the Constitution. When senior officers, people whose credibility is rooted in decades of service rather than political calculation, when they say that what's happening violates those values, it gives permission to military families and veterans to reconsider their political alignments. It reframes the question from which candidate is tougher to which candidate actually respects the institution of the military and the constitutional limits on its use. This could matter enormously in swing states with large veteran populations. It could matter among independent voters who respect military leadership. It could matter among moderate Republicans who are uncomfortable with Trump but haven't had a framework for understanding why. When generals say this is dangerous, when they use words like threat to the Constitution, when they invoke the specter of dictatorship, it gives those voters a way to articulate concerns that might have felt vague before. It's not just that they don't like Trump's personality. It's that the military establishment is warning that his conduct threatens fundamental democratic institutions. Of course, not everyone will be persuaded. Trump's core supporters have shown remarkable resilience in the face of criticism from all kinds of establishment figures. But military criticism is different. It comes from an institution that still commands broad respect across the political spectrum.
It comes from people who aren't politicians, who aren't trying to get elected, who have nothing to gain personally from speaking out. In fact, they have things to lose: relationships with former colleagues who support Trump, standing in military communities that might be divided, the comfort of staying out of politics. The fact that they're speaking out anyway at personal and professional cost lends credibility to their warnings.
So here's the bottom line. We are in unprecedented territory in American civil-military relations. The traditional code of silence among retired senior military officers has been broken, not by one disgruntled individual, but by multiple four-star generals and admirals who served for decades under presidents of both parties. They are warning in clear and alarming language that the patterns they're seeing, the politicization of the military, the proposals for domestic deployment, the attacks on legal constraints, the demands for personal loyalty, these patterns threaten not just the institution of the armed forces, but constitutional democracy itself. These warnings cannot be dismissed as partisan attacks. These are professionals who understand at the deepest level what happens when the relationship between military power and democratic governance breaks down. They've studied the fall of republics. They've seen how authoritarian leaders use military force to consolidate power. They know that the erosion of norms doesn't happen all at once. It happens gradually, through repeated violations that become normalized, through attacks on anyone who defends institutional boundaries, through the slow subordination of professional military judgment to political demands. The question they're implicitly raising is profound. What constitutes betrayal of the Constitution? Is it only overt rebellion, armed insurrection, clear-cut treason? Or can it happen through sustained erosion of constitutional norms, through disregard for legal limits, through the transformation of institutions meant to serve the public into tools of personal power? The retired generals speaking out believe we're seeing the latter. They believe the threat is real, immediate, and existential to the kind of republic the United States has been for nearly 250 years.
Their central message is this: the military exists to defend the Constitution, not to serve any individual's political ambitions. That principle is not negotiable. It's not a suggestion. It's the foundation of everything that makes the American military different from the armed forces of authoritarian states. When that principle is threatened, when political leaders treat the military as a personal instrument, when they attack the very concept of legal limits on military power, when they demand loyalty to themselves rather than to constitutional principles, that's when democracies are in danger. That's when people who have spent their lives in uniform, who have every reason to stay quiet and enjoy their retirement, feel compelled to speak out. The stakes extend far beyond one election or one presidency. If the precedents being set now take hold, if the erosion of civil-military norms continues, if the boundaries between lawful military authority and political power continue to blur, the damage will last for generations. Future presidents will inherit a playbook for politicizing the military. Future service members will inherit confusion about whether their oath is to the Constitution or to whoever currently occupies the White House. Future citizens will inherit a country where military power can be wielded against domestic populations with fewer and fewer institutional checks. That's why these warnings matter. That's why they deserve to be heard, understood, and taken seriously by every American, regardless of political affiliation. The retired four-star officers speaking out aren't asking you to vote a certain way. They're asking you to understand what's at stake. They're asking you to recognize that some things are bigger than partisan politics. The integrity of the military, the sanctity of the constitutional oath, the boundaries that prevent authoritarian abuse of power, these aren't Republican or Democratic issues. These are American issues. These are the foundations that make self-government possible.
Watch this space carefully. Watch how current and future political leaders respond to these warnings. Watch whether they dismiss them as partisan attacks or take them seriously as institutional concerns. Watch whether the norms being violated now get restored or whether the violations continue and accelerate. Watch whether the military remains a nonpartisan institution loyal to the Constitution or becomes increasingly politicized and divided. The answers to those questions will determine not just the next few years, but the next few decades of American democracy. This story is far from over. In fact, it may just be beginning. And what happens next will define whether the warnings from these military leaders were heeded in time or became epitaphs for a republic that didn't recognize the danger until it was too late.